Good evening. Thank you for joining us. My name is Sarah Zenaida Gould, and I'm the Executive Director of the Mexican American Civil Rights Institute. Welcome to tonight's conversation about El Paso's historic Segundo Barrio. This is the first of a series on Mexican American civil rights historic sites, and I'd like to thank the National Trust for Historic Preservation for supporting this series. Tonight, we are joined by two El Paso-based historians, Yoland Leyva, Associate Professor of History and Director of the Institute of Oral History at the University of Texas at El Paso, and David Dorado Romo, author of Ringside Seat to a Revolution, an Underground Cultural History of El Paso and Juarez, 1893 to 1923. So, welcome, Yolanda and David. It's so good to see you.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Segundo Barrio, known as one of the oldest neighborhoods in El Paso, can you just launch us into this? What does that mean, and why is this a significant neighborhood?
Segundo Barrio is not the oldest neighborhood. We'll talk about the oldest neighborhood as well, but it's a neighborhood that has been home to thousands of Mexican immigrants and their families over the past 140 years. And we can think of it as the Ellis Island of the Southwest, even though it precedes Ellis Island. So El Paso was the main port of entry from Mexico to the United States through much of the 20th century, and El Segundo Barrio is literally on the border. When you cross from Juarez to El Paso through the more historic bridges, you walk into El Segundo Barrio. What would you like to add, David?
Yeah, I agree. I think Segundo Barrio tells an origin story not only of El Paso and the borderlands, but probably the United States. So the Camino Real crossed right down the middle of the Segundo Barrio. So the Camino Real is during the Spanish colonial area. Mexico City and Santa Fe were connected by this road that was based on previous indigenous passageways. So 1598 is one of those origin stories of the United States that precedes Plymouth Rock by more than 20 years. And that's when Oñate leads 400 European Spanish settlers. And they initiate this kind of transnational migration, this back and forth migration. So that tells that origin story. And so there's so many stories in this place. It was a plotting ground and a hiding ground for so many Mexican revolutionaries during the Mexican Revolution. So you have people like Flores Magón, Pancho Villa, Francisco Madero, Teresita Urrea, that used the Segundo Barrio to hide, to organize, to run revolutionary newspapers. It's also the birthplace of the Pachuco movement. And a lot of the Chicano movement, like in 1972, the first meeting of La Raza Unida was held in the Segundo Barrio. So it's just full of incredibly rich history.
It is within a 6-block area of El Segundo Barrio. You can talk about indigenous settlements all the way through the 20th century. As David mentioned, the Mexican Revolution. You can talk about braceros. You can talk about the Chicano movement. You can talk about the muralists today. It's just layers and layers of history. So given this context, David and I wanted to talk about the struggle to really save El Segundo Barrio. So I'm going to put up a PowerPoint, and David and I will both be talking about it. Let me put that up. So hopefully everyone can see this.
Yeah, it looks great. Thank you.
Okay, great. So in 2006, a very secretive group, the Paso del Norte group, comprised of politicians, the wealthiest developers in town, created this downtown revitalization plan. which talked about, bringing downtown back to how it used to be. And I'm going to turn it over to David right now because it was David who discovered the reality of what was being called the Downtown Revitalization Plan. And this is a map from that plan.
Yeah, thank you, Yolanda. So this map is labeled not. I think in the side. I'm not sure. I'm not sure if you can see it, but it's labeled not for distribution. It was a kind of a private map, and the reason I got a hold of it, and this was back in 2006. I got a hold of it before it became public because my book had just come out, Ringside Sea to a Revolution, and somehow I was getting invited to all these, I don't know, cocktail parties. And this group of binational developers, it was a secretive organization called the Paso del Norte um, uh, group. They invited me and they showed me this map. And they said, look, tell us where there might be some historical sites that maybe we'll save, maybe we won't. But this is where we plan on creating this massive demolition and displacement. And so, like you see that big, huge red circle, that was going to be a Walmart, and everything. It's kind of hard to see, but everything, kind of where the yellow and the orange, right north to that, right. That's the Segundo Barrio. There's another neighborhood called Duranguito that was going to be a sports arena. Where you see the purple P, that's the Farm Worker Center. And so I had spent so many years not only researching. I mean, I'm a multi-generation at Paso, and a lot of my family, my grandfather used to be a baker there in the Segundo Barrio. So I saw all these places have a lot of meaning. And so this map was not just a map, like when it showed up. It was a map of people, not only a map of spaces. So I remember seeing this map and it just kind of hit me in the gut. So that was how I found out about it. Then we had a meeting, and Dr. Leyva and myself, Yolanda and myself, were the organizers of that meeting. We created a group called Paso del Sur, in opposition to this group of developers called Paso del Norte.
So this is the legend that goes with the map, and it really followed the standard plan for gentrification, where you can see here they were going to plan an arts walk, and it was a binational arts walk. They were going to create 6.4 acres of retail, and that part of it, Segundo Barrio, is very pedestrian heavy, and people cross the border from Juarez to El Paso to shop every day. So it already has a retail aspect to it, but they were talking about having luxury stores, having little cafes, and then a Walmart, of course, a big box store. So they were planning, it turns out, to demolish. Remind me how many acres, David?
It was 127 acres and displaced about 1,800 Barrio residents.
So this is a neighborhood that's north of it, Segundo, that we're going to talk about in a second, Barrio Duranguito. So this downtown plan had more than simply demolishing 130 acres of it, Segundo, but it also sought to demolish the oldest neighborhood in El Paso, a neighborhood that, like its Segundo, is Mexican and Mexican American, extremely historic, and filled with the most vulnerable of people who have little resources, and in the case of Duranguito, were mostly senior citizens, but who were willing to stand up for their communities. This is a study that over the years has gained a lot of attention. The city council commissioned um, a branding study from this firm, Glass Beach. Glass Beach didn't exist before and it didn't exist after. It was a firm that was created specifically for this cause. And it made a comparison. What is El Paso today and what could El Paso be? Do you want to talk about these slides, David?
Sure. So, yeah. So the city, as Dr. Leyva said, paid $100,000 for this study. And so this is the image of what El Paso is today. It's an old Chevy truck, 1970s, old, reliable, dirty, not exciting. So if we destroy Segundo Barrio and Duranguito and gentrify, what are we going to look like as a city? And so this is the next slide. We are going to be a brand new, shiny, gas guzzling Infinity SUV. And so the words here are new, reliable, practical, style, exciting, but not too pretentious. Um, it, some people kind of laugh at this. It's like I don't know, but when you see the next slides, you're probably not going to laugh as much. So if El Paso were a person, what would it be according to this branding study? It would be an old cowboy, an old Mexicano, male, 50 to 60 years old, gritty, dirty, lazy, speaks Spanish, uneducated. So, grant the city of El Paso and its representatives voted unanimously to adopt this branding study. They seem to have no understanding of just how offensive and how racist this imagery is. The next image is what El Paso would be like. Who do we want to attract to El Paso once it's gentrified? You want to attract male, females, the 30 to 40-year-old age group who are educated, entrepreneurial, bilingual, family, and who enjoy entertainment. And so the picture is of Matthew McConaughey and Penelope Cruz, who is Hispanic but European Hispanic.
So when you make the comparison between those two slides, the image of what El Paso is now uses the kind of language, dirty and lazy, that we've been hearing in Texas going back to the 1820s as a way to denigrate us. So when, and I just have to add a personal note that when David talked to me, and I remember the exact moment when he talked to me about what was really behind the downtown plan, I felt sick to my stomach because, like David, my familial roots on my mother's side are in El Segundo Barrio, and I had several generations that lived there. So we had those ancestral roots, and we reached out to people who were living there at the time. And this senora right here lived right there in South Oregon, and she was very vocal and very active. Protests began immediately, and I don't think that the city council or the city government understood that there would be a backlash to their plan to destroy the barrio. I think that they believed that because, well, as they said, we're uneducated and lazy, that nothing would happen, that they could move forward with this plan that was put forth by the Paso del Norte group. But it didn't happen. People spoke up, both people who supported the barrio, like Paso del Sur, and the residents themselves. This is from a protest outside of the Civic Center in 2006. So there was resistance. There was resistance from not only supporters of the barrio residents, The Catholic Church supported the fight against demolition. Sacred Heart Church, which is the oldest Spanish-speaking church in El Paso, had a priest who was very vocal in defense of the people of El Segundo. And I always remember that after much fighting, the city finally said, "Oh, we will not demolish the church." And what Father Rafael Garcia said was, the church is not the building, the church is the people. If you keep the building but displace all the people, there still will be no church. So the church was very involved in the resistance, as were some business people who also um, fought on behalf of their business locations. So there was resistance. Do you want to talk, David, a little bit about what happened after 2006 before we move on to Duranguito?
Yeah. Okay. So just to add, the resistance was binational because this was a binational consortium of some of the richest people on both sides of the border. Artists from both sides of the border played a big role in this resistance. So this Segundo Barrio, it was an emblem that a lot of people have used in a T-shirt. It's called Colectivo Resiste, the art group, and they were from Ciudad Juarez. David Flores was the leader of this. Artists played a huge role. Artistas, muralistas, activistas, as they called themselves, because in a sense, this gentrification displacement project was an attempt to erase us, to disappear us. And art is usually the best weapon to fight against that erasure. Um, yeah, why don't we go to the next slide?
To the next slide or to Duranguito?
Okay, we can go to the Duranguito PowerPoint.
So I'm stopping sharing for a moment so I can switch to another set of images. But I did want to say that one of the things that happened is the city council voted to implement the 2006 plan and to demolish this huge part of its Segundo Barrio. And I will remember always that day. It was on Halloween Day. And I was sitting next to the senora that was in the photo earlier protesting. And we were in city council and we walked across the street and she was just devastated that after all the organizing, all the people speaking up, that the city council would so casually say, "We're going to displace all of you. We're going to demolish it." The recession came in 2008, and the resistance was able to slow the process down enough that then the demolition didn't happen. I'm going to open up another set of images because 10 years later, it came back.
So this is 10 years later. In 2016, the same group of developers decides to come back and said, all right, we weren't able to get rid of the Segundo Barrio, build the Walmart there, but we are going to try to build what we call a multicultural purpose center. They hit the name arena, but what they really wanted to do was a publicly financed sports arena under the veneer of a multicultural purpose center. And so this set of slides is called the struggle for Duranguito. And it really brought a lot of people together. And we organized very, very quickly. The city on October 16th, 2016, decided that they were going to open the discussion for the use of eminent domain. So eminent domain is when you force people to sell either homes and properties. to get rid of the properties and the people in Duranguito in order to build this arena. And by Thursday, they voted on it. And this is the daughter of Romelia Mendoza speaking in front of city council. And there were very few people in that first meeting because they took everybody by surprise.
Yeah, and by surprise, we mean that the residents of Barrio Duranguito, who are mostly renters, mostly older than 65 with a median income of $900 a month, they found out that the city council was going to vote whether to demolish their barrio. They found out from the news on a Thursday, and the city council voted on a Tuesday. So to say that they were taken by surprise is an understatement. But they organized very quickly.
So let's go back to that image of how the imagery actualizes it. It becomes real on the ground. So this is the image that we saw of the elderly Mexicano man, the first person to be evicted from Duranguito was an elderly man. He's 85 years old who looked very much like that image. This Chavita, Salvador Chavita Ortiz. He was incredibly just funny. He was a friend of Tintan, like the Golden Pachuco, one of the most famous Pachuco movie stars in Mexico. And he knew him when he was still at the radio station in Juarez. And that the image to the side is he was the recipient of the first eviction notice in Duranguito. And that happened on Christmas, during Christmas week in 2016.
Yeah, one of the things that happened was that some of the residents, like Chavita, spoke out against the city council's vote to demolish Duranguito in order to build an arena. So when he spoke out and another resident spoke out, it was published at the UTEP newspaper, The Prospector. It came out on the front page. And because they had spoken out publicly to the media, they were the first to be targeted for eviction. So the eviction notice said that he was being evicted for not paying the rent, but we had all the receipts. He had always paid his rent.
So that's just another copy, I believe, of the eviction notice or the kinds of, in his case, no, this has nothing to do with him specifically. This is a payment, a payout payment for a lot of the residents in Duranguito. And it was kind of this kind of deal of either we turn off your electricity or the city will give you $10,000 to relocate. And that money disappeared very quickly.
So if you could imagine, well, let me back up a little bit. The reason that the city suddenly was offering residents, as you can see here, over $10,000 to move was because the city was basically forcing people out of their homes and they had to follow federal law. So suddenly they start to offer people money, but also the property owner that owned most of the property that they wanted to demolish, who was a member of the Paso del Norte group, who had purchased property back in 2003, 2004, knowing that an arena would be built there, but before it was public knowledge, he hired what he called a property manager for that area. But what the property manager was actually doing is going door to door and telling people, as Dr. Romo just said, like, sign this or we'll turn off your electricity. Or he would knock on the windows of women's homes at night, or he would call incessantly. So it was a tremendous amount of stress for the people. we saw them falling into depression. And as David can confirm, some of the older people had to leave because of their health. So $10,000 sounded like a lot for people who are making $900 a month, but that money really was nothing.
Mm-hmm. You want to talk about this image, Dr. Leyva?
Sure. As Dr. Romo said, artists have been key to spreading the message of resistance, but also the message of these are places of beauty. One of the artists that worked with us in Duranguito is Jose Montoya, who is a muralist, a photographer. In order to pay homage to Chavita, he painted this mural right there in the middle of Duranguito with a quote. Chavita had told a reporter, when the reporter asked him, well, don't you want to move? He said, estoy a gusto aquí. He wanted to stay there. And that's one of the things that was very heartbreaking and really made us angry, was that these older people were being displaced. And a couple were moved to some relatively new housing projects, so very beautiful inside. But they found themselves going from a close-knit community to isolation. So they could have been in this much more beautiful apartment, but they still started to get sick. Chavita passed away in 2019. He was a man who we would see walking the streets. All the neighbors would keep an eye on him. When we had our meetings on Friday nights, if he wasn't able to make it, although he usually was there, but when he couldn't make it, the neighbors made sure to make a plate of food for him and take it to him. So this was a neighborhood that they would always tell us was like a family. They loved each other, they fought with each other, but they watched out for each other. And what the city did was tear the fabric of this community.
Yeah, Dr. Mindy Fullilove calls it, she writes a book and she calls it root shock. And the effects of displacement, especially on the elderly, and increasing the rates of mortality and disease among the elderly, is like very well documented. And that's exactly what happened among several of the residents in El Paso.
The very first time that Dr. Romo and I met with the residents was in the apartment of this lady that you see with a black top on. And we met in her very small apartment. It was the older women from the neighborhood, and David and I were there, and we offered our assistance because we'd had the experience as Paso del Sur in El Segundo. And we asked them, how can we help? We weren't going to tell them, you need to do this, you need to do that. We asked, what do you want us to do? How can we help you? What do you want? And they said, we want two things. First, we want the neighborhood to be preserved, and then we want them to fix our apartments, fix our homes. And I always remember one of the ladies said, we have to go to the streets. They were very ready to defend their community. And this is one of our early meetings that we had outside at a park right there in Duranguito. And you can see Chavita right there on the bench. Do you want to talk about Tonita?
Oh, Tonita Morales, she has become the face of the anti-gentrification struggle, not only in Duranguito, but almost in the United States. I mean, people have come to interview her, including the New York Times, the LA Times. She was on NBC's Nightly News with Lester Holt. Um, this movement has a lot of traction. I think it's very symbolic. What's going on in Duranguito reminds us of other historic acts. For instance, the destruction of hundreds of homes in Chavez Ravine in Los Angeles to build Dodger Stadium. So this is the same case of hundreds of Mexican people, Mexican immigrants who are being displaced by their homes to build an arena. It's so. I think the experience of Mexican Americans in this country is quintessentially one of displacement, and maybe from the very beginning. And I think it stirs up deep emotions in a lot of us. And Toñita, well, Dr. Leyva has interviewed her. Why don't you tell them a little bit about her personal story?
Tonita's 94 years old, and she is eloquent. She is tough. She is a very fierce defender of her community. She had 1 year of schooling, and she always says, I don't know how to talk, but when you hear her talk, she understands the way that economics work, she understands the way politics work, and she understands community. She worked until her 70s. She has lived in the apartment that she lives in since the 60s. And even before that, she lived in Duranguito. She's a very long time resident of that barrio. In the 1990s, because she saw that Duranguito needed a lot of help in terms of ridding the barrio of crime, for example, cleaning up, physically cleaning up the barrio. She organized a community initiative to clean the barrio, and she worked with the police to make it a safer place. And since the 90s, she has been a strong community leader. When the struggle began to protect Duranguito from demolition, she stepped right up, and she has spoken to countless elected officials. She has gone door to door with her neighbors to encourage them to get organized. And, I'm not half, I'm 30 years younger than her. I'm not half as energetic as she is. I am not half as strong as she is. And she truly is the face of this movement to preserve this barrio. And I think that is so important that we follow the lead of the people who live there versus coming in and telling people what they need.
Yeah, you can see Toñita, or it says El barrio no se vende, se defiende in the background. This was a city council meeting in December 2016 when it seemed like we had won. The city of El Paso, the representatives and mayors said, we're going to take Duranguito off the chopping block. We're not going to destroy your homes. We're going to instead renovate the existing civic center of El Paso, only for 3 weeks, and then they went back on it. And I just want to reaffirm what Dr. Leyva said. In terms of our style of organization, we uh, we back up the residents. We always ask permission or their uh, their ideas. We follow their leadership. Our 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 expertise as historians is only to offer support, and sometimes we literally put up platforms and microphones, right? So that's what we do. We have the technical knowledge to set up microphones. So it is the voice of the residents themselves who speak. And Toñita is definitely one of these Mexican American leaders that there should be a book about her.
There should be a book about her. She has an amazing life story, including moving to Chicago when she was in her 20s and working 3 different jobs. She's an amazing woman. I admire her. We all admire her a lot.
Absolutely. Maybe we can show a few more slides and at this point open it up to questions. What do you think, Dr. Leyva?
That sounds good.
These are just slides of the struggle, of the lucha. So this was a posada that we had in Duranguito. And the church, the Catholic Church, has been very supportive from the Segundo Barrio. So these are residents from Segundo Barrio who had fought against the destruction of their neighborhood, and now they were showing support to Duranguito.
And the priest that you see on the right, that's Father Garcia, who we mentioned earlier is a strong advocate in the 2006 struggle. He had an idea in 2016 that we should have a posada in Duranguito, but it would be a posada where we go house to house asking for lodging. It's the reenactment of Mary and Joseph asking for lodging, but that we would add, we can't give you lodging because they're going to displace us. So it was a way to bring a spiritual aspect, a cultural aspect, but always with an eye on the fact that we are fighting for this barrio.
Maybe this is a good place to stop, and
Okay.
we're going to open it up for questions.
Thank you so much for walking us through how the community has stood up to protect these historic communities in El Paso. I think that when we say, because everybody says it's important to know your history, when people say that, the first thing that often comes to mind is that it's important to know the stories of the past. And absolutely, it is important to know the stories of the past. But another aspect of that is that it's important to know the places that tell those stories. Those places are also important. And so places like Segundo Barrio or like Duranguita have embedded in them this history of, and in these two cases, this history of a binational, bicultural, working class community that has in many ways been the backbone of El Paso over the years. So, and then of course the people there, they also carry that history with them. So one of the things I would like to ask the two of you to talk about is how when the history of a place isn't necessarily obvious to people, what are some ways to educate the public about historic places? And I'm hoping when you answer that, you will also tell us about Museo Arbano.
So let me start before we talk about Museo Arbano. There were 2 questions that people in El Segundo asked us when we first started organizing that really struck me. And they were both excellent questions. One was, why do you care? And I would say, oh, my abuelita, David's abuelita. And they would say, okay, but why do you care? So that, I think, was such an important question to ask us. And the second one was, why is this barrio so important? Why are you spending time trying to save it? So there were several ways that we tried to share history. One was very textual. My graduate students and an undergraduate put together a small booklet, a bilingual booklet about the history of El Segundo. We distributed. But what I think was more effective was the beginning of Museo Arbano, which David can talk about because it was really him bringing this idea. And then if you want to talk about the mural on the Sacred Heart Gym.
Okay. So I think that the mural at Sacred Heart Gym by Francisco Delgado, who was a boy student, a student of the Segundo Barrio, and I had met him when I was a director of the Bridge Center for Contemporary Art in El Paso. and he had just come back with a degree from Yale University, and his work was constantly being censored because it was, I guess, too radical for a lot of like um, the mainstream galleries in El Paso, and I showed it at my gallery. So as soon as we found out about this, I asked I asked Francisco Delgado, can we create a public installation, a kind of museo without walls, where we talk about all the incredible history of El Paso and the Segundo Barrio. And we did it at the Sacred Heart Gym. So the city has said, yeah, we're going to tear it down. It's a building from the 1950s. Well, that's where, as we said before, the first meeting of La Raza Unida uh, party took place. So you have like these major Mexican American civil rights figures, Reyes Tijerina, Jorge Gonzalez, Jose Angel Gutierrez were there in 1972. And so that was one of the places where the first mural in the Segundo Barrio was done by the Campaña por Preservación del Barrio in the 1970s under Carmen Felix. So it had rich historical importance. And so that place showed where the first novel of the Mexican Revolution was written, Los de Abajo. It's right across Sacred Heart Church. It showed where Victor Ochoa was testing out his flying machines back in the early turn of the 20th century. And he was from the Segundo Barrio. A lot of figures from the book that I had just published at that time, Ringside Seat to a Revolution. So for us, we created Museo Arbano with that idea in mind of taking history to the people in the same way that Muralismo takes it to the people. Not people that might not want to go to the UTEP Museum or the official El Paso Museum of History that usually for a very long time, and thankfully that's changed recently, just presented a very whitewashed, literally whitewashed version of El Paso's history. So we created it in the space where Teresita Urrea had lived back in 1896. So Teresita Urrea has another just fascinating story if you haven't read about her, and I encourage you to look into it. And I don't know, do you want to give some details of what was inside that museo, Dr. Leyva?
So we rented with this little tiny grant, we rented 2 tenement apartments in the building. The building itself is amazing. It was the first federal customs house. It was the Mexican preparatory school. It had a Chinese laundry. It was where Teresita Urrea lived. It was where Henry Flipper, the first African American graduate of West Point, lived. It had Chinese residents. So it was a boarding house for African American women. It was an amazing place. So we rented it and we dedicated one, and we're talking about very small, tenement apartments. The entry was dedicated to the history of El Segundo Barrio. Then we went into another room dedicated to Teresita Urrea and traditional Mexican healing. And the way that, let me back up. On the outside, in the courthouse, in the courtyard, we had commissioned a mural by David Flores that Dr. Romo mentioned earlier. And it was to honor Pachuco culture, and it had Edmundo Tostado, or Don Tosti, who was the first Latino composer to sell 1 million albums. And he grew up right there. He was born on South Oregon and grew up on South Oregon. So people were drawn to that space because the history resonated with them. So when David Flores did the mural, young men, and it was young men coming from the neighborhood, asked if they could also do murals. So then we had the courtyard filled with these small murals with various themes. And I'm going to tell you 2 stories that show you how much this space meant to the people of that community. One of the murals was very beautiful, very simple. It was the Farmworker Eagle. And one Sunday I was sweeping the courtyard. We were all we lived with volunteers doing everything, and Dr. Romo and I were doing everything. So I'm sweeping the courtyard, and this elderly woman comes by and she says, "Can I come in and see the mural?" And I said, "Of course." And she said, "You know, I was a farm worker, and I was in a union before that farm workers union." And out of her wallet, she pulled her union card that was from before I was born. It was from the early 50s, and she had always kept it. So I thought, if given the opportunity, people will tell their histories. And the other short story I want to say is that it is a very old building, and the front door never shut right unless you knew exactly, you had to stand like this and push it like that. So one day, when it was a Monday, I don't know why, when at 7:30 in the morning, I was so in love with that space. I just wanted 7:30 in the morning to see it. And there were men outside the front, and they're like, "Hi, we're so glad that you're here. We've been guarding it for you." Because whoever closed it the night before hadn't quite closed it right, and the wind had blown it open. And when they saw that that door was open, men who we did not know, they were residents, they came and they stood guard so nothing would be stolen. And to me, those are examples of how a building can have so much life and so much history embedded in it, and it draws people to it. The building, the history, the art, all draw people to them. And to me, the that was the beautiful thing about Museo Arbano when we were on South Oregon.
Mhm. We do have some questions from the audience. And this is the perennial question. I'm going to put it up. How do we balance economic investment and preserve the socio-cultural fabric of communities?
Okay. Yes, that is the perennial question. So in the case of Segundo Barrio, and especially Duranguito, it doesn't make economic sense to destroy the city's oldest neighborhood to build a publicly funded arena. There have been so many economic studies by some of the major economists in the United States. It says, to begin with, arenas don't really create a bigger slice of the pie. They just transfer one slice of the pie in one part of the city to another. So many cities in the United States are now like they're refusing when you get these billionaire developers who want the public to pay for their own arenas. They're just saying, you pay for them yourself. So in 2012, the city of El Paso passed a bond with very misleading language. People didn't know exactly that it was going to be an arena, and they didn't say where it was going to be. El Paso is huge. They have so much land. There's this incredible urban sprawl. It does not need to be in a place where there's already people living there, especially the most vulnerable community people. Um, so it doesn't make sense because most arenas will cost today the size of arena that they want to build in Duranguito will cost about $500 million. The city is running out of money. It only has $150 million. So we've told people, if you want to create this multi-purpose cultural center, why don't you fix up the the civic center? But the developers están aferrados. They insist that it has to be in Duranguito because they have a lot of land and hotels one street away in downtown El Paso. So it has less to do with economics and more to do with economic power that's often verges on corruption, if not just outright corrupt.
And also, that question reminds me that one of the efforts that we made with the residents was to ask them, and we started in 2016 going door to door, what do you want in your neighborhood? And together we created a plan for the Duranguito, our and our being the residents' plan for Duranguito. And they wanted housing. They wanted good housing. So I think that's one way to keep that community fabric together. And I don't know if you want to talk more about the other things in the alternative plan.
Yes. So when we had this little 3 week breathing period that the city had said, okay, we're going to save Duranguito, we went home to home with a group of residents and said, what would you like to see there? And yeah, a lot of them said, yeah, it would be wonderful. We have these wonderful alley parks. We enhance this space with art, and they just had a beautiful vision. But they wanted to balance social services, everything from I don't know, after school tutorial centers to tortillerias. They wanted to find a balance between the people that are already there and serve their social needs, and find some way of rent control is illegal in Texas, but some way of making sure that gentrification doesn't raise the rents. But at the same time, use that space as a cultural heritage site. You know, the Segundo Barrio in Duranguito tell a different origin story of this country. So people should come from all over, literally the world, and they have been. Now that we're in the middle of the lucha, so I think we created this plan. It was called Plan for the Rebirth of Duranguito, and it had this idea of spaces that are broken and fragmented. When you put them together, kind of how the Japanese they use these fragments, kintsugi, of broken teacups and use gold epoxy to put them together. That was our vision for Duranguito, that it had now a special character because of all of these luchas. There's been contestation there since Duranguito used to be an Apache Mescalero peace camp of the Ende people. There were about 1,000 people in Duranguito back in the 1790s, and these were the precursors of the reservations. It has just so much history. It's the birthplace of El Paso. So yeah, we have to promote it rather than tear it down and hide it under some kind of cement tomb. But it has to be balanced with the people that are already there. Remember those slides. The elderly people are just seen as obstacles to progress. How are they seen as enriching progress? We want to turn that vision upside down. So that's why we created this plan for the alternative vision of Duranguito.
Wow. Okay. We have another question from the audience here. How can we support this movement if we don't live in El Paso? My wife and I grew up there and would love to show our support for an area of El Paso where we grew up. Is there anything people can do to help?
Do you want to start, Dr. Leyva?
Yeah, one thing I would say is to Mr. Dominguez, if you have family here still, to share this information with them, so that they can tell their neighbors. It's, really is right now in the hands of our city council. So we need to put pressure on our city council not to demolish this historic place. So if you have family here in El Paso, definitely spread the word. Since you're not living here in El Paso, if you could even write letters to the editor of the newspaper here expressing your support for the neighborhood, that would help, because we do want to keep this alive in discussions here in El Paso, that this is happening and that people are being affected by it. What else do you think, David?
Yes, and thank you so much, Dr. Senada Gold, and for giving us the opportunity to reach out, because this is a struggle, I think, not only for Duranguito and El Paso, but it really is a struggle to preserve the memory of fronterizos and I call us Native Hispanic people, Latinos, whatever you want to call us, right? It's less than 2% of all official historic landmarks in the United States have to do anything with color, people of color. I'm sorry, people of color, brown people, black people. Those histories are totally erased. So I think raising that consciousness is very important. And thank you for your program today for doing that.
I'm glad you brought up that statistic about the 2% of uh, registered historic landmarks representing the history of people of color. Because one of the things that has happened that perhaps is going to help Segundo Barrio, but it has not happened for Duranguito, is that just recently, Segundo Barrio became a national historic district, which is a federal designation. Um, and it doesn't necessarily have a lot of teeth to it, but it is um, maybe we would describe it as important symbolically. I'm not sure if you want to maybe talk about the process of how that happened for Segundo Barrio, and is there any chance of that happening for Duranguito?
Well, if I could start with the Duranguito part, here's how power works in El Paso. Downtown El Paso was also nominated for that federal designation, and it included Duranguito. The developers told the city council and the county commissioners that they would not support that nomination, and their support was needed for the nomination. They would not support that nomination if Duranguito remained in the nomination because they didn't want it protected.
Yes, we have thoroughly documented like the central importance of every single building in Duranguito that they want to knock down. There's a building, for instance, one of the last remaining standing buildings in El Paso of what was known as Chinatown back in the turn of the century. It was the largest Chinese community in Texas. Why? Because the railroads, when they reached in 1881, when they reached El Paso, the Southern Pacific, hundreds of Asian workers remained in El Paso. And this was before the Chinese Exclusion Act. So there's a Chinese laundry that's going to be torn down. We tried to obtain a national landmark status for that. And these developers, through the El Paso Chamber of Commerce, sent a letter saying that if you do that, we're going to sue you. They really played hardball. There's another building right next to where Toñita lives, and that was from 1898, and it was owned by the president of B'nai Zion, the Orthodox Jewish community in El Paso, and that's where they had the first Yom Kippur with a full quorum in El Paso. So that tells the story of Jewish migration. So we're talking about global fronterizo migration, and a lot of these people, including the so-called Buffalo soldiers, the Chinese workers, they would come and they would insert themselves into fronterizo society. They would immediately assimilate, and often because these immigrants from China, they didn't. The women wouldn't come. They would intermarry with fronterizas, and they would learn Spanish. So it tells a story of global migration. Every single building is a textbook, and we fully document it, thoroughly with hundreds of citations. And at every step of the way, the developers tried to block us. So right now, thankfully, the reason we have been able to extend this lucha for so long is because we have won a few court battles. And one of the court battles was that the city tried to hire, well, they did hire an archaeological firm from Houston to conduct a survey, because by law, the Texas Antiquities tells you if you're going to destroy more than 10 acres, you need to do an archaeological survey first. And this group knew very little about, especially the indigenous roots of El Paso. They did not know that there was an Ende community there, an Apache Mezcalero establecimiento de paz, they called it in Spanish, a peace camp. And so we were able to thoroughly document by using, primary sources from the colonial period. We went to court, and of course we won because they didn't even bother to look at the local archives when they come here. This company from Houston. So they were the strategy of of hiring an outside firm that would just quickly rush the study and sign off on the survey so that they can in turn demolish this building backfired on them. And so right now we only won that court case, proving with the city was not able to contest our documentation, and the city is appealing it to the Texas Supreme Court. So history has become a kind of battleground in this struggle against gentrification and displacement. And we feel very grateful that some of our research skills at least have been able to slow down the full destruction of Duranguito.
Oh, well, thank you. That takes me to one last audience question that I'm just going to expand a little bit because she was specifically asking about you, David. But for both of you, as you have been uncovering this history and using it as a way to say, wait a minute, these places matter, have you experienced backlash?
Go ahead, Dr. Leyva.
Yes, we have experienced some backlash, but that includes our work on this side of the border and the other side of the border. We were also working with a community on the outskirts of Juarez that was also being attacked again by the same developers, same binational developers. And in that case, the developers had hired gang members to, I guess, attack us. So that was like the most scary physical thing that has happened to us. And I think in 2006 and 7, there was a lot of media criticism of our organizing. You know, we were called a lot of things like ankle biters, stuff like that.
Originally, I think after my book came, Paso, I would call them, I don't know, the elite, the movers and shakers, would invite me. And I think that's why they invited me to one of their semi-secret meetings to share with me their plans, because I guess they thought that because I was their friend, I would help to legitimize this in the public eye somehow. And when I said absolutely not. So yeah, a lot of social doors were closed, I think, opportunities, because all of a sudden we were seen as obstructionists to progress. And unfortunately, some of the people were friends who had liberal politics in terms of, I don't know, immigration, especially since one of the leaders of this movement to gentrify and destroy Segundo Barrio in Duranguito was Beto O'Rourke. So at that time, he was city council, and his father-in-law, Bill Sanders, was one of the major impetus of this this secret group of developers, a billionaire who owned lands on both sides of the border. So it was the Verde group that had contacts on the Mexican side with some, let's just say, very shady businessmen. And when we united both sides, then all of a sudden it became very, very dangerous. One of the attorneys that was defending the people of this other community, Lomas del Poleo, was shot down with an AK-47, and that was very, very traumatic. And I think so. Yes, it's so much easier to write about dead people as an historian than to write about living people. Because dead people, Pancho Villa doesn't shoot back. I'm trying to make a gallows humor joke here, but yeah, history can sometimes be dangerous.
It is true. I think that what we see a lot of times, and I will just say for MACRI, because we focus on Mexican American civil rights history, but a lot of uncovering Mexican American civil rights history takes some courage, because it is challenging maybe what the status quo story was. And so it takes that courage. So I wanted to say how thankful I am that you brought this story to us, and that you're continuing your work with the community. It's really obvious how passionate you are for the community, and that your heart is in this. So I want to thank you so much for sharing all of this information with us tonight. As I mentioned at the beginning of the hour, this is the first of a four-part series about Mexican American civil rights history and historic places. So we have more of these events coming up, and I'll just put up the schedule here. Next month, we'll be talking about Marfa's Blackwell School, which is a Mexican school. So if you've seen some of our earlier MACRI talks about school segregation, this is one of the segregated schools for Mexican students, which is in Marfa, Texas. We'll be learning about what they're doing there. In September, we'll be learning about the Rio Vista Farm in Socorro, Texas, just outside of El Paso. This was one of the Bracero processing centers during the Bracero program. And then we're still working out the date, but in November, we'll be talking about the Felix Longoria affair in Three Rivers, Texas. So all historic sites that have significance to Mexican American civil rights history. We hope you'll join us for those. Also, today is the last of our events for the month of July, but join us in 2 weeks, and we will be with Dr. Guadalupe San Miguel of the University of Houston, who will be talking about a new book that he has. And let me give you the complete name of the book: In the Midst of Radicalism, Mexican American Moderates During the Chicano Movement. So he'll be talking about that book just in 2 weeks if you want to join us then. I hope you enjoyed tonight's presentation. I encourage all of you to learn more about MACRI at somosmacri.org. We regularly host talks with passionate historians like these, and we're building the first museum dedicated to Mexican American civil rights history, and we need your support. So please visit our website, subscribe to our newsletter, follow us on social media. Thank you again, Dr. Leyva, Dr. Romo. It was a pleasure talking with you tonight. And I hope everyone has a safe evening, and we'll see you next time. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.